Where do I think this is going? I personally believe that the Israeli state is not a tenable structure. I personally believe that even if there were no Palestinians in the world, the Israeli state would ultimately self-destruct. The question is how much misery it's going to do before this happens.
For a brief moment, the eyes of the world were fixed on Israel again when the elections from November 2021 resulted in the right-wing Likud bloc, led by Benjamin Netanyahu, securing a victory with 64 seats in the 120-seat parliament. The consequent political upheaval owes much of its momentum to the meteoric rise of Jewish power, which is spearheaded by Itamar Ben-Gvir. Ben-Gvir, who carries the legacy of the ultra-right rabbi and politician Meir Kahane, represents a religious, fundamentalist, nationalist strain of politics that has repeatedly employed terror as a means to an end.
The Arab is a cancer in our midst. And you don't coexist with a cancer. A cancer you either cut out and throw out, or you die.
Ben-Gvir's past association with a terror organization and his admiration for the perpetrator of the 1994 Hebron massacre, Baruch Goldstein, have sent shockwaves through the political landscape. Amidst this tumult, voices from the so-called liberal Zionist camp, although liberal is probably a relative in this context, express dismay, decrying the emergence of what they perceive as a new Israel. The prominent New York Times commentator Thomas Friedman, who is known for his unapologetic support for Israel, is now telling his readers that the Israel we knew is gone. But, as you will see in a moment, this assertion is wrong because it is based on a fundamental flaw in thinking, which is why Thomas Suarez, author and historical researcher, challenges these narratives head-on in the following interview. Tom argues that throughout its history, the Zionist movement has always employed terrorism as a means to achieve its objectives. Through Tom's meticulous research, primarily drawn from the British National Archive, we can get a glimpse into how terror was strategically used by the Zionist movement to accomplish its goals. In a seemingly unbelievable twist, there were even instances when this terror targeted Jews if it was deemed to serve the broader Zionist cause. Today, Israeli terror has evolved into an organized, state-sanctioned, automated and AI-powered form that presents itself as deterrence rather than terror. That's a framing that propagates the image of Israel being the victim and under perpetual threat of annihilation. This image of perpetual threat and annihilation is essential because without it, people like Ben-Gvir and potentially even Netanyahu would hardly ever have come to power. While Itamar Ben-Gvir may be a more outspoken figure compared to, say, Benny Gantz, who is seen as a more liberal alternative to Netanyahu, it is important to remember that Ben-Gvir would not be the first of his kind to hold high office in Israel. The great Ben-Gurion himself, Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, to name just a few, were closely linked with what US and UK intelligence services called Zionist terror movements, yet, as we know, all of them rose to the position of Israel's prime minister. Tom reminds us that the recent elections, which have brought ultra-right-wing forces back to power, have not ushered in a new Israel that's fundamentally different from the one we knew before. It's still the same Israel. But the Zionist PR machine, which I believe is the best in the world, has done an excellent job at erasing and whitewashing part of Israel's history. So anyone lamenting over a so-called new Israel or that the Israel we knew is gone either does not understand its history or tries to sell a flawed story. Tom has faced heavy criticism for his books, which of course is not surprising given the topic and his line of argumentation. But what he is saying is fully in line with the likes of Noam Chomsky, Avi Schleim, Gideon Levy, Miko Pellet, or even Benny Morris, all of which I've interviewed if you're interested. But for now, let's lean back for another fascinating discussion. And here we go. Tom Suarez. Thank you so much for joining. It's my pleasure having you. How are you?
My pleasure. Thank you.
To put this a little bit in context, yeah, I interviewed Noam Chomsky the second time not so long ago. And during the interview, he mentioned your name. And after the interview, I had a couple of email exchanges and I inquired about who is Tom Suarez and what exactly is he doing. And then Noam Chomsky said, you wrote this book.
Yes.
And that he believes this book will be suppressed because of the information it contains. Now, needlessly to say, my interest was spiked. I got the book, I read it, completely. And I reached out via your email, which is tomsuarez.com. And here we are. So it was a very uncomplicated process. So really appreciate that you agreed to doing this.
Well, I'm grateful to Professor Chomsky, who I've never met or had contact with. So I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, so I recommend everybody watch the interview with Noam Chomsky. It's an intriguing one, and you will also find the context with Tom Suarez. Now, I have pages and pages of notes in front of me, partly from your book. And as I said already, I don't want to make this especially about the book, but there is so much information in there which I believe, and I completely agree with Noam here. First of all, it corrects an image that I had, in regards to specifically the creation, the pre and post creation period of the State of Israel, right? Now, I was thinking how to best start this conversation because there is so much we could discuss, but maybe we indeed go first in this. It's actually longer than a decade, from 1937, 1938 to beginning of the 1950s. It went even into the period where the State of Israel was already corrected, where there was I can also only call it a decade of terror, right? Yes. And one last thing, I interviewed Gideon Levy, yes, I think 10 days ago, and he said something what struck me, because he said, okay, the terror wave prior to the State of Israel, in his mind, to some degree, somehow he still could find a justification for it. Yeah, but he said specifically what happened after the creation of the State of Israel, there is just no, he can't just justify it in any form or shape. Yeah, so there is this kind of demarcation line, prior and post, right? Mm-hmm. So I thought maybe I'm asking you, where would you like to start?
I think you need to start in the late 19th century, in the foundation of the Zionist ideology. And to me, the issue is that, notwithstanding the fact that many Jews in Europe and Russia were, in fact, the victims of horrible pogroms and persecution, and if they heard, well, there's this new idea where we can go and have our own dignity and start our new lives, sure, I would have signed up too. But the difference between that and what the Zionist establishment itself, the Zionist leaders, had in mind, which, as far as I see from the beginning, the purpose of Zionism was not an escape for persecuted Jews. The purpose of Zionism was the state itself. Now, if the purpose was to help Jews suffering persecution, then all along any solution to this would have been welcomed. In other words, any place where Jews might go to start a new life where they would be happy would be fine. But no, it wasn't. It was always a case where only the settlements of Palestine were allowed to be the answer. And beyond that, the fact that it wasn't even just going to Palestine to settle, but it was to settle as usurpers rather than as equals in a shared society. And that was the case from the beginning, and obviously it's more and more obvious as the days go on.
Yeah, I think you say something really important here, because I fell exactly in the same trap. I thought, the creation of Israel was kind of, I don't want to say triggered, but was closely related to the Holocaust in Nazi Germany, right? And this is also where I think I said it to Benny Morris when I interviewed him, yeah? I suffer from a cognitive dissonance, yeah? Whilst I can associate myself or sympathize with, the creation of Israel as a consequence of the Holocaust, I don't understand what's happening today. Yeah? But that was my error in thinking. Because exactly as you describe, first of all, this whole Zionism development started way earlier than, the Second World War. And secondly, and this was completely new to me, the Zionism movement used the Holocaust as a justification to proceed with they were already busy with, right? And from your book, what especially struck me also is that Zionism, the early leaders of Zionism from Ben-Gurion onwards, tried actually to direct the refugee stream in a certain direction. They attacked the refugee stream if the stream did not go into Palestine/Israel, right? And they were very successful in doing so.
Yes, the idea of the settler state itself was always the goal, and persecuted Jews, even during the Holocaust, were the fuel for this goal.
It delivered justifications. Yeah. Now, very much on top of my list is some misconceptions about the creation of Israel, and I think you could list us a couple.
The common wisdom for the creation of the state itself is that the United Nations in 1947 they put their heads together to decide, what do we do with this problem, and they decided the solution was to partition the land into two, give a state to the Zionists and give a state to the Palestinians, and the myth is that the Zionists accepted this with gratitude, whereas the Palestinians said, no way. Now, it's true, of course, the Palestinians said, you got to be kidding. No, this is outrageous. We will not accept this. And they were correct to refuse this. The myth is that the Zionists did accept it. No, they didn't. They went along with it at the UN, yes, but that was only a ploy to establish the fact of a state. Once they had the state, then the state was the one thing that was powerful enough to get rid of partition and to ethnically cleanse however much land they could grab. Now, in 1948, they pushed this as far as they felt they safely could. And ever since 1948, even before the 1967 war, ever since then, it has been this slow process of doing what they failed to complete in 1948, which is to get everything from the river to the sea with as few non-Jews in it as possible.
And I think you referenced a letter from Ben-Gurion to his brother where he wrote him exactly that, that they're only accepting the partition of a future Israel, i.e. the two-state solution as a means to an end.
Yes, that letter is very well known, but that letter is only one piece of the evidence. In fact, even British and U.S. intelligence, they knew this all along. At least as early as a year before the partition vote, they were telling each other that they knew that this whole business of a Palestinian state was a charade. There was going to be no Palestinian state. This was all a way for the British to wash their hands of the catastrophe they had created so they could just walk away from it. But they knew in advance, the whole thing was cynical. They knew in advance what was going to happen now.
This whole discussion about the two-state solution reminds me a little bit about the contemporary challenge that we're having, and that's the two Minsk agreements, right? Because we know from President Hollande and from Chancellor Merkel that the two Minsk agreements were only meant to stall for time till Ukraine was strong enough to counter Russia, right?
Yes.
So the two-state solution has exactly the same aim.
Yeah, yes, I agree, yes.
Yeah. Out of curiosity, Where did you get, or how did you get access to all those documents?
Most of the documents that I relied on are freely available at the National Archives of the UK. Now, a lot of the material, a lot of the most interesting material was not declassified until fairly recently, but it's all publicly available. Now, there are a few documents that I had to petition to have declassified, and in a few cases I was successful. In a few cases I was not successful. The, One of the instances in which they refused my access is interesting because it involves British activity in Iraq 80 years ago, when you would have thought, what's there possibly to hide? But my access was refused on national security grounds, and this all had to do with the anti-Jewish pogroms in Iraq in 1941, where there has always been the suspicion that this had nothing to do with the Iraqis, but that this was a false flag operation by the British. Now, some material that I was able to have declassified, despite redaction, strongly supports that idea. I personally believe that the one that they wouldn't let me see, even redacted, proved it.
So what you're saying is that there was a false flag operation to drive the Jewish population out of Iraq,
Yes.
out of Baghdad, and into Palestine slash
Well,
Israel, right?
the reason a decade after that there was the Zionist operation to ethnically cleanse Jews from Iraq to force them to go to Israel. At the time, a decade earlier, the purpose was for the British to have an excuse to regain control of Iraq.
Okay. Since we briefly spoke about you, and I should probably have done this at the very beginning, maybe you give us, in a nutshell, a short composition of who are you? Because I know you are a composer. How did you come from being a composer to writing a book called Palesting Hijacked?
It's true. My main day job for most of my life was I'm a violinist, and yes, I compose, but I've always had other interests. When I was a teenager, I grew up during the Vietnam War, and like so many of my peers, I spent much of my time fighting against the U.S. war against Vietnam. I had the good luck to be in a family where my parents always encouraged us to think critically and never to accept anything we saw on the nightly news. And after the Vietnam War ended, as the years went on, not immediately, but as the years went on, Palestine seemed to be the other major colonial war of aggression for which my native country, the United States, was principally responsible. And certainly there were other crimes that the United States had committed. You could take Allende in Chile, but they were specific events that happened. There was the coup, the overthrow of the democratically elected government, and the rest then went on all on its own. Whereas with Palestine, it required the day-to-day maintenance by the United States, and the hypocrisy is so outrageous that the issue of Palestine, I believe, takes on dimensions far above itself. It, in my mind, and I think in a lot of people's mind, it's the line in the sand between the decades of Western imperialism and hypocrisy and what we claim to be as a society.
Yeah, and I thought I read somewhere you were living a couple of years somewhere in the Middle East.
I
Not entirely sure.
I lived in the West Bank. I was living in Bethlehem, and every day crossing checkpoint 300 to go to East
Yeah.
Jerusalem, where I taught violin. And from there, in the summer of 2014, there were the protective edge atrocities against Gaza, and after that, the branch of the music conservatory in Gaza City needed a violin teacher. They asked me if I would do it, and I said yes. But then we spent the rest of that year into 2015 trying to get past the Israeli blockade. So for a while, I taught my students in Gaza from Bethlehem by Skype, but that's it really is not a permanent solution. So although I was in Gaza with some activists from the United States via Egypt shortly after Cast Lead in early 2009, I failed to ever meet my violin and viola students in Gaza.
Yeah, and we're having this interview, of course, in the context of the mass demonstrations that are happening in Israel right now. I think it was on Monday or yesterday, Monday, I believe, when Benjamin Netanyahu and his right-wing government actually pushed through the first tranche of the changes in regards to, the judiciary system through. But the protests are still ongoing, as far as I can see. And to my surprise, from what I've seen on social media, the Israeli police force, I think, it's not the military, right? It's the police force. They are quite hard-handed. So it seems to me the Israeli population gets a first taste of what is BAU, as a business as usual for the Palestinian population.
Yes, it was amusing to see, although obviously what the Israeli protesters are seeing is nothing compared to what the Palestinians get every day. It was amusing to see that, as far as I'm aware, for the first time, the Israeli state used the, I forget what they call it, the skunk chemical, the so-called skunk stuff, against Israelis.
In the water cannons, yeah.
But
against their own population.
There may be something iconic or symbolic about the fact that they actually use this horrific stuff. I know it firsthand, this skunk stuff against Israeli citizens. But no, Israelis still don't know what the life of the Palestinians is under Israeli apartheid.
I think this is such a crucial and easily overlooked detail that you just said. Not only the Israeli population, because Gideon Levis told me that he came first into contact with a real Palestinian when he was 24, 25. Not only the Israeli population, but also the Western population, the rest of the world population, yeah? We have no real idea of what's really going on there, how drastic and draconic the life of the Palestinians actually is, yeah? And forget terrorism, that's not what we talk about, yeah? Just to go to your job, yeah? I saw somewhere they have to go, to cross those checkpoints. At 3:30 in the morning, they have to be already there. There are a couple of, 1,000 other people just to go to work at 7 or 8 o'clock somewhere in Israel. And that every single day. And whilst they are going through this extremely dehumanizing process of crossing one single border check, right, they're harassed. Yeah, they're beaten up. I saw, and this every day. This is not, I don't think this is really... I said somewhere else, I believe in the inherent goodness of people, okay? That's why I believe if the Americans, if the Germans, if I'm here in the Netherlands, yeah, if they really would know what's going on, this would not be tolerated. But of course you have a very sophisticated PR machine on the Israeli side, which has its tentacles everywhere. Yeah. And if I say everywhere, it's not on the high level, it's also on the grassroots level.
Yes, right? Every country, every nation state has its national narrative, which is largely mythical, but especially settler states like the United States and like Israel, they have national narratives which cannot really acknowledge the truth. Now, I have never seen a national narrative be so effective as Israelis, but you can't blame it on them, because the fact is that we in the West, all Western countries, we've allowed them to put us under their shell of disinformation. The Palestinians have no choice. They're the subject of blockades and apartheid. They have no say in that. We have a choice. We've willingly allowed ourselves to be behind an Israeli wall of misinformation. And the really egregious states, in a way, the worst of all is Germany, because if Germany has some responsibility for its past, that responsibility is against racial nationalism. Yet that is precisely what it's shielding by shielding the Israeli state no matter what it does.
Yeah, I said it also on some of the other interviews. Yeah, it's eerily the images that you're seeing right now. And again, it's very thin ice, and I'm not comparing what's happening now in Israel and in Palestine with the Holocaust. That's not what I'm doing.
Yes.
Yeah, but some of the images that we are seeing are eerily similar. I mean, if you watch them in black and white, you could think it's from 1940s, right? Now, there's one little thing. So the Western population, yeah, is as easily manipulated as any other population, right? But when we look about the geopolitical level, yeah, after 1967, the US has a geopolitical interest of Israel being where it is, and there are also large groups. And again, I don't want to reference Noam Chomsky too often, yeah, but he told me about some evangelicals, a 60 million strong part of the fragmented evangelicals, which have an interest of Israel being there, but he said it for anti-Semitic reasons that not even Hitler would have conceived, right? Because they are saying we want Israel there because it will ignite the conflict and it will lead to Armageddon. Yeah. So basically, they don't want the Jews in America. That was also a reason. Wait a second. I read too much now, but I think it was in your book where even Ben Gurion said the Americans should be happy because they don't want them, so all the Jews have to come. Yeah, that type of thing. So it's a really twisted. Yeah, but very briefly, geopolitics. There are geopolitical interests to having. I always say Tony Blair was the poodle from Bush. Yeah. But Bibi Netanyahu is the pit bull of the US.
The irony, to me, the great irony of support for Zionism, as you say, all along Zionism was appealing to many people precisely because it was a way to look like you're doing a nice thing, but to get Jews to move away from your shores. And the Zionists even used this without much subtlety in the 1940s as an advertisement for supporting Zionism, that support us, otherwise the Jews will come to your shores. The ultimate irony is, as I see it, is that Zionism is actually, to my mind, the worst form of anti-Semitism. It is the ultimate manifestation of anti-Semitism because, in contrast to conventional anti-Semitism, despite all its horrors, conventional anti-Semitism is powerless to make its libels true. That's the one thing it couldn't do. Zionism, if we accept Zionism at its word, succeeds. The question of why the Western public allows this to go on in their name, with their money, obviously with U.S. government and most Western governments' complicity, Israel has managed to dehumanize the Palestinians. But there's actually, I would argue that there's a bit of a bait and switch over here because the object of Israeli apartheid, it's not actually Palestinians. It's anyone, river to sea, who is not Jewish. Now, it happens at this point in time that all the non-Jews between the river and the sea are Palestinian. Why? Because early in the 20th century, when the Zionists first began to settle, the native Arab Palestinian Jews were segregated by the Zionists and incorporated into the settlement. So as a result of that, after the Zionists, yes, all the Palestinians that were left were non-Jews, but that's not their crime per se. Their crime is not being Jewish. Now, we in the West, we're comfortable with Palestinians being dehumanized. For many people in the West, you say Palestinian and automatically you cringe. But the Israelis couldn't do this with non-Jews. They couldn't dehumanize non-Jews. So the very identity, the Palestinian identity, is in a sense it's a deliberate diversion so that they could get away with this.
Yeah. There are a couple of things. So I don't know if you saw it, but Lex Friedman just interviewed Benjamin Netanyahu, I think 2 weeks ago, something like that. Yeah. So as a behavior analyst, I have the transcript from the whole interview in front of me. I just pulled it up. Yeah. So I'm analyzing this whole thing. I'm specialized in linguistic deception markers. Yeah.
Yes.
But since you said two things, because you said dehumanization, right? So that's a sentence from Netanyahu. The deliberate hatred, the incitement of hatred against one community, it's demonizing, the legitimization that goes with it, a very dangerous thing. That's a very dangerous thing. Yeah. But he meant, of course, in the context of Israel, if Israel is dehumanized, yeah, is hate incited against, yeah. But he didn't catch the irony, because it's so true what he says, yeah. Irrespective, it's also true for the Palestinians, right?
The hidden message in Netanyahu's statement is that Israel has succeeded in making a nation state and an ethnicity, what label one wants to use for people of Jewish identity, whether you call it an ethnicity or more properly people of a religious belief, whatever you call it, what we refer to as the Jews, making this ethnicity synonymous with a nation state. Now, this is Israel's great weapon, because it uses Jewish identity as a human shield. You try to attack the Israeli state, but no, this human shield of Jewish identity we hold in front. So if you do, you will, in effect, be criticizing Jews. The interesting thing is that this is the perfect it's a perfect definition of bigotry. The example I like to use is that during the spread of COVID-19 in the United States, and no doubt elsewhere, Asian-looking people or Chinese-looking people were attacked. Why? Well, because the virus came from China. The Chinese, caused it, so we attack the Chinese. Now, this is garden variety bigotry, and we all condemn it. Israel does precisely this to Jews, but turns it around, saying, yes, the Jews are the ones doing what the Israeli state does. So if you criticize us, you are attacking Jews. It's exactly the same bigotry, but turned around. And instead of condemning it, we make it into United States law.
Yeah. I will come back to that you said Jews attacked. But before, I want to cite one more statement from Netanyahu in the interview with Lex. He said he equates Zionism, also anti-Zionism, with anti-Semitism, right? And that's exactly how he paralyzed whole of Europe in criticizing anything that the Israeli state does, because by implication, again, as you said, whatever criticism or valid criticism you may have against the state of Israel, he diverts this kind of negative energy as being directed against the Jews, which is absolutely not the case.
Well, it's more than not the case. It's an obscenity to juxtapose the two. That an identity, by virtue of being a member of this identity, by virtue of that, you are one with whatever a nation state does. This is an aberration.
And he uses it purposefully and consciously. He calls himself a reader of history. He said it a couple of times in this interview. I think I found it 3 or 4 times. Reader of history, right? A very selective reader of history, yeah. Or, I mean, I don't want to minimize him. Yeah, he's a smart guy. Yeah, he's battle tested both on the battlefield and in the political arena. He knows what he's doing, right? So any statement that he says, I think, is purposefully made, right? But I would like to come back to the Jews attack, because I read a statement. I have to think now. I read a statement. It was like, I'm paraphrasing here. Yeah, some Israelis hate the Jews in Israel more than the Palestinians. I found that interesting. Then I did a bit of digging, and I saw indeed on social media you can easily find plenty of videos where you have ultra-Orthodox Jews attacked viciously by the Israeli police and by other segments of the Israeli population. Can you elaborate?
Well, in a word, no, it's not an area that I feel I have any insight into. Earlier in the Zionist project, it was the religious Jews who were against the Zionists. It's an
Still are. Still
it's
are.
an
Yeah.
interesting issue which I can't comment on, but it's an interesting issue as to when that began to change to the point where what we have today, where there are religious Jews who, possibly because they're exempt from military service and because they're supported by the state, that some of the secular Israelis are resentful against them. But at the same time, some of the most vicious settlers are vicious on a messianic religious level. But again, it's not something that I feel I have anything to add.
Yeah, we're gonna come back to the settlers and to the messianic tint a little bit later. But before we do, because we spoke already about this perfect PR machine from Israel, right? And one of the words that Netanyahu used was sloganized, yeah. But again, he meant it against Israel. But one of the best slogans I've come across is the slogan about a land without people for a people without land. Yeah,
Yes.
this is so ingrained in everything. So I know there are two segments in your book where you write about this. So tell us how empty Israel really was when how empty Palestine really was when the Zionists took it over.
Like a lot of questions like this, ultimately, I think that it's almost a mistake I will answer, but it's almost a mistake to get sidetracked by these, to take these questions seriously, because let's say that Palestine was completely vacant of human beings. Let's just accept that. Okay, so what does that have to do today with the fact that we have all these people living between the river and the sea? Forget who they are, how they got there. We have these people living there. Half of them have full rights of citizenship. Half of them have no rights, no political rights, no human rights. It doesn't make any difference whether the land was vacant 100 years ago or 200 years ago. So in a way, this is all a distraction. But beyond that, to answer the question, obviously Palestine was a thriving civilization, and this is not up for negotiation. There's a long history to Palestine. One can look at, thankfully, the photographic method was developed in time for there to be a wealth of photographs of Palestine before Zionists ever set foot on it. But again, I'm reluctant to get too involved with these arguments because they implicitly add legitimacy to what I consider to be a straw issue.
Okay, I still try. I have another one. Israel is the most moral army in the world, yeah. And maybe we make a difference between, let's say, the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Lehi this period versus the Israeli Defense Force from now, please.
Well, the Israeli Defense Forces was, of course, the sum of the Haganah and the Irgun and Lehi all put together. And the conventional wisdom is that the Haganah was defensive, which, I mean, it's silly. The Haganah took part in many atrocities, and the first major undertaking that the Haganah did was to assassinate a fellow Jew because he was anti-Zionist. So the idea that this is a defensive organization was silly from the beginning. The Irgun, of course, is considered to be more radical than the Haganah, and they certainly carried out more large-scale destruction than the Haganah did until 1948, when everything changed. And Lehi was the smallest and the most fanatical, and they were the most fanatical in a spiritual sense because they really, all evidence suggests that they really perceive themselves as the designated prophets to regain what had been this alleged great Hebrew civilization and to reinstate it. And they were the assassination specialists. They caused the least large-scale destruction, but eventually these organizations merged along with with Jewish soldiers that were trained in the Jewish brigade beginning in the second half of 1944, which was an army trained by the British, where the Jewish agency in Palestine tried to deter the settlers from joining the Allied effort against the Nazis unless it was in a situation that would benefit Zionism. And the way it would benefit Zionism was if there were a segregated Jewish contingent to the army. And the reason was twofold. One, so that the British would train the settlers to be very good soldiers, to be better able to take Palestine by force. And the other reason, which is probably even more important, was that the very idea of a segregated British unit was used as a de facto claim of Jewish nationality and therefore Jewish statehood, i.e. Israeli statehood. But all these put together became the Haganah.
Yeah, and these groups, all three of them, Haganah, Lehi, and Irgun, they were extremely aggressive, right? And not only that, many future politicians, as Menachem Begin, he was with the Irgun, yeah? They attacked the King David Hotel. Then you have Yitzhak Shamir, he was from the Lehi, yeah? Yes. They have it in front of me, the Minister Lord Moyen, and the UN meditator from, I think it was from Sweden, Bernadotte, yes. Yeah? So this was not, they even wanted to send letter bombs to Winston Churchill, then Haganah, David Ben-Gurion, Moshe Sharet, Golda Meir, Yitzhak Rabin, right? So all of these politicians, they actually came from, yes. How shall I say this, from those terrorists, what the British and the US government called terroristic yes. groups, yeah?
Yeah, today we think of the King David Hotel bombing has become the poster child of Zionist terrorism. But actually, that was one event among many, many events, and it wasn't even the worst. And you mentioned Bernadotte, the assassination of Bernadotte, which is almost universally attributed to Lehi. But actually, there is, in my view, pretty convincing proof in documents held by the British that although Lehi assassins, yes, pulled the trigger, they were not working for Lehi. They were working for Ben-Gurion. I think I consider this to be without question.
Yeah. But can you tell us about the Jewish Agency? That was an organization that was completely new to me.
The Jewish Agency was the embryonic Israeli government. It was established by the British in order to run what was thought to be the internal affairs of the Zionist settlements. And it still exists in name as far as I know, but it was the organization that allegedly accepted partition, and it then became Ben-Gurion at the end of the mandate. Ben-Gurion was the head of the Jewish Agency, and then he became the first prime minister, and Chaim Weizmann the first president.
I read in your book that America had a post-war loan hanging over the head of the UK, yes. Right? And Israel, so the Zionist movement used this loan via the influence in America yes. to kind of coerce Great Britain, or that was one of the means to coerce Great Britain to do what they wanted to do. Yeah. But at the end, and I don't know if you can say it that drastic, but it seems to me that the Zionist movement basically kicked the British out of Palestine.
Well, yes, the British would have been happy to keep this pied-à-terre in the Middle East, to keep Palestine, but it simply became untenable. It was too much trouble. But the Zionists,
It was too much trouble because of all those terrorist
yes,
attacks,
yeah,
to be
even
clear, right? Yeah.
100,000 British soldiers were unable to keep the peace in Palestine. The Zionists needed the British for three reasons. At the beginning, they needed the British to lend some sort of official political legitimacy to the settlements, that they had some uh, beginning sovereignty. And they needed the British to keep down the revolt of the indigenous people that everybody knew would come. And the Zionists early on were unable to put down the rebellion of the indigenous people, but they knew the British could do it, and the British did. And finally, the third function of the British for the Zionists was that in what the Zionists refer to as the War of Independence, which is, I've always found to be a funny phrase, but the Zionists needed the fact of the British occupation in order to present the Zionist conquest of Palestine as an emancipation, from the British occupation. They obviously couldn't pull this off logistically if there was no British occupation. They needed the British occupation to present their conquest of Palestine as a war of independence.
And they still need this kind of perpetual survival threat,
Yes.
yeah, to legitimize all those policies that are being implemented.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, just out of curiosity, you did a lot of research. What would be, I don't know, the 3 or 4, I cannot say most enlightening things that you found, but you know, the things that impressed you most?
I think the most important things would be the things that would actually contribute to positive change today. I think that these historical matters, there's two aspects. There are things that, yes, it's very interesting what happened in the past and we should know it. But the history of Palestine is not just history. We're still living this history. And the purpose of history should be to lay all this to rest, to end it once and for all. And in that respect, I think that the most important thing is to expose the actual problem, which is Zionism. That's the root of everything. And by exposing Zionism for what it really is, and to expose its child, the Israeli state, for what it is, we live under this idea that the one thing we can never do, the absolute greatest evil would be to question the legitimacy of the Israeli state. No. The Israeli state is the problem. The Israeli state is the political manifestation of Zionism. It is the problem. We must question the right of the Israeli state to exist. We should question the right of any state to exist. No nation state has the intrinsic right to exist. Nation states are inventions, in theory, by the people for whom they serve as a governing structure. The people in any land, they are the only ones with the right to exist. Nation states are structures that exist at their pleasure. Now, there are certainly, Israel's not the only state like this, but Israel does not exist with the consent of the majority people whose lives it controls. So we must stop this now, and yes, question the right of the Israeli state to exist. And when you do that, then you demonstrate that it does not exist with the consent of the people it controls. Therefore, it, not the people living there, lets everybody stay as equals. Settlers, people in the outposts, fine. Everybody stays as equal citizens. The Israeli state must be replaced with a state of all its people. And the history of the region supports this.
Yeah, I think it's very important here to underline that questioning the state of Israel does not mean to push all Israelis into the oceans, right? That's not what we're talking about here.
Yes, but that's always used as the knee-jerk reaction. Of course, the irony is that the only people ever have to been pushed into the sea in Palestine, aside from immigrant ships that were not allowed to land, but it was of course the Zionists that pushed the Palestinians into the sea in places like Jaffa and further north.
Yeah, and Benny Morris told me it's a simple matter of demographics. If Israel would allow, or if Israel would become a real democracy, and we can talk about the irony about the demonstrations going on right now for a democracy when 50% of your population is basically held at gunpoint. Yeah, but if Israel would be allowed to become a democracy, then overnight it would stop being a Jewish state, and that's not what even Benny Morris said. That's not what I want. He used the first person pronoun, right? That's not what I want, and I think that's what many Israelis don't want. They don't want they want to have a Jewish majority state.
Yes, to rephrase what Benny Morris is saying. In other words, what is the Israeli state? It is a state which is defined by blood descent, and the genetic parameters of this state are defined by the state itself, and the only people who are actual citizens of this state in the full political sense, they are people of this bloodline that is designated by the state. Now, you put this in any other context, and we would look at it and say, this is horrific, this is a travesty, this is against everything we, as the modern enlightened West, claim to believe in. Yeah. So if we're going to accept the existence of the Israeli state, then we have to accept that there's going to be apartheid, and that anybody who is not Jewish can be expelled on any whim. We have to accept this because we've accepted that the state must have a majority of people of this particular bloodline. So either we have to say, yep, this is good with us, or we have to say that the Israeli state itself has no right to exist.
I think at the moment, globally, it goes more in the other direction, right? So I see that in the US, it's even penalized now to boycott Israel. I saw in Germany, a lawyer was arrested because he protested. No, they wanted to have a demonstration, but for the Nakba, right?
Yes.
Memorizing the Nakba, they were all arrested. Yeah. So even talking about, or things like BDSM, the BDSM movement, of course, is quite a threat, I think, to Israel. I don't know how strong it is. I don't know. Maybe you know more about this.
Well, Germany is the worst, but it's much stronger in other Western countries than we realize, because so much of the censorship is self-censorship. Now, the State Department in the United States has officially adopted the so-called IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is, of course, not a definition at all, but it is purely a Zionist tool. Now, this was de facto adopted by the State Department earlier, but it's now official policy. But the fact is that even without that, for decades, people have been terrified to criticize the Israeli state. And everybody knows that if you want to get tenure, if you want to keep your job, if you want to be able to report on anything, whatever it is, if you cross that invisible line, you're out. Everybody knows this, so everybody behaves with the rare people who were either courageous enough or unthinking enough to get themselves in trouble. So you didn't even need to have this to be official policy of the State Department. People self-censor, and that is the most insidious type of censorship, because unlike, for example, Germany, where a lawyer says the wrong thing and gets arrested, there's no trace of self-censorship. So there's not even a record that this was going on.
Do you think that the things that are happening right now in Israel, this this move from Netanyahu to grab more power, to undermine the judiciary system, do you think that this would allow an opening for criticism against Israel that's not widely labeled as anti-Semitism?
The, the irony is that some Israelis are now asking the United States to boycott Israel in order to get rid of the allegedly right-wing government. But no, I think that what this is going to do is to reinforce the mythology of a day when Israel was a liberal democracy. And look, it's such a shame what has happened to it now. Now, it's possible that as things go on, maybe there'll be an avalanche effect whereby the criticism which is now in vogue because of this so-called extreme government, whether that will lead to a reconsideration of the state itself, I don't know. Personally, I don't see that happening yet. I simply see this as reinforcing the myth of the original nice Israel.
Yeah, Gideon Levy said exactly the same thing. He said they have this government now because the whole population moved to the right.
Yes.
Yeah, it's this vicious circle from more violence against Palestinians, more pushback from the Palestinians, the more the society moves more and more to the right. Yeah? And that brings us now to the messianic undertones. Right? Now, I completely understand why Israel is, I don't know if it's afraid is the right word, yeah, but is afraid of a nuclear-armed Iran. I completely understand it. And let's disregard the fact, let's not even look at how Iran was created so how the current situation in Iran was created by the US by putting a legitimate leader, yeah, and installing a extreme violent government under the Shah.
Yes.
Yeah? So I understand this, yeah. But now we come in a direction where you have, and these are not my words, you have messianic elements in the government, right? And Israel actually has a nuclear bomb, right? So if this trend continues, if Netanyahu cannot contain this genie in a bottle that he apparently has unleashed, right? Where could this go?
As regards nuclear weapons,
in regards to, I mean, I have a statement here from Noam Chomsky from his interview with me. He said, when you have this kind of government, it becomes unpredictable. Ben Gvir and Smotrich, those guys might do whatever they feel like and blow up the world. But who cares? God is on our side. Yeah. So Noam Chomsky is let's say concerned about the fact that this type of people, this type of elements in a messianic government that actually hopes for the return of the Messiah, right, has a nuclear bomb.
I defer to Professor Chomsky on that. But the idea of messianism in the Israeli state has, of course, ever been there. It didn't need the right-wing government for that. Israel has always used this device of messianism to make itself the modern nation state and the Hebrew kingdoms of the Old Testament, to make these one and the same. And this is quite out in the open. Most people, even secular people in the West, in their minds, really, they make this connection that Israel is the same thing. And Winston Churchill, among many others, he openly referred to it as this state that he was partly responsible for creating, as in fact the reconstitution of the biblical realm. And this plays powerfully into the Western collective subconscious, and of course is largely to account for the concept of the advent of the Christian Zionists. But whether messianism in itself will have an effect on whether Israel should use the bomb, again, I defer to Professor Chomsky, but I wouldn't think so. It would certainly seem to be self-defeating.
it would be self-defeating. But again, if you have elements in a government who are as fundamentalist in their views as potentially, and I can't speak for Iran, but the image that we're getting from Iran as those religious fundamentalists, I think that's quite a toxic mix.
I think the question then is whether the extraordinary messianic fundamentalism of the government is sincere or a tactic. Now, I personally believe that early on, at least, people like Ben Gurion, that all this messianic construct, that they didn't believe this. This was a political tactic they used, and they used it very successfully. Now, I can only hope that the same cynicism pervades the current Israeli government, in which case I'm correct that they wouldn't do that. But whether they've come to believe their own myths, I don't know.
Where do you think is this going?
Where do I think this is going? I personally believe that the Israeli state is not a tenable structure. I personally believe that even if there were no Palestinians in the world, the Israeli state would ultimately self-destruct. The question is how much misery it's going to do before this happens. What I personally see happening as the most peaceful resolution, and I hope I'm right about this, but I know many people think that I'm being unrealistic, is that in a bizarre way, the settlers are the answer. Now, no, I don't like the settlers, but in a bizarre way, they are the answer, because if this current government gets what it wants, and the settlers completely take over the West Bank, no more charade. We now know what has been the case for decades, that Israel has annexed the West Bank. It's not an occupation, it's an annexation, and soon to be an annexation of the Gaza Strip. If we accept that this is the case and the settlers completely take over, then the whole idea that this is an occupation and that the Palestinians have their own make-believe government called the Palestinian Authority, and therefore there's some excuse for why they cannot vote in Israeli elections because they vote for this mythical Palestinian Authority, the whole charade's gone then. Thanks to the settlers, the West will no longer be able to maintain this charade. So what's left over? What's left over is an apartheid state. No one will be able to deny this anymore. Now, again, I think the best case scenario is that the annexation of the entire region from the river to the sea by the Israeli state becomes unescapable. No one can deny this anymore, thanks to the right-wing government. And once that happens, there's no way that we will be able to call it anything but a racist apartheid state. And when that happens, the Israeli state as such will become untenable. There'll be no solution except for equal rights to be granted to everyone from the river to the sea, which means that the Israeli state as such ceases to exist.
I think it was Smotrich, he said he wants to send another 1 million settlers in the occupied territories. Yeah? And Netanyahu said, and I believe him there is no way to turn this back. Yeah? So they are creating facts on the ground. Well, never say never. Yeah? Who says that what they're building today in those, what he called urban blocks, yes, you know, in Samaria and Judea, which is actually in the West Bank, urban blocks, yeah? As if that would change anything. Who says they will not be occupied by Palestinians somewhere in the future? Yeah. Yes. So never say never. Tom, is there anything that you still want to add? Any topic, any item that we have not yet discussed?
No, I thank you for all the intelligent questions. I would just say to anybody who is listening to this and agrees with both of our standpoint, to be active, support BDS, petition your local lawmakers that yes, this is in our control. We can do this. This is not something that's beyond our control. And as for all of us, which is probably the majority of people watching this, all of us who are tax-paying citizens in a Western country, it's not a choice for us as to whether we want to fix this atrocity. It's our responsibility because we're doing this. We're the ones that are making this possible. And as people in an allegedly democratic society, we are the ones responsible for what our governments do.
As a behavior analyst, I've learned, the best incentive is to appeal to self-preservation, right? And I think you have a really strong argument here, because if we do not, we collectively, the global human society, if we do not fix this issue with Israel, there is a real potential that the conflict might ignite the whole globe, because the Middle East is a powder keg.
Yes.
And that's not just a stereotype.
Yes.
It de facto is. There converge so many interests of powerful nations that there is a real potential here that this goes completely the wrong way, and then you can forget, the Russian-Ukraine also the proxy war between US and Russia, even the coming war with China. Yeah,
Yes.
there are so many issues right now. You just need a spark
Yes.
to ignite somewhere.
Yes.
I think it's in all our interests as humans, right, to see that certain things cannot be done in the 21st century.
Yes.
Okay. Tom Suarez, I will put the links to your website
Thank you.
in the description of this YouTube interview. Okay. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
It was my pleasure.
Thank you.